Hello and welcome back to the dosage calculation prep series. This is part of a full series on preparation for dosage calculation, so please make sure that you go back to the beginning. I've included the math packet below that you can actually print out, and that way you can follow along with each step. But it's important to follow along in the steps in order to get ready for learning dosage calculations. So make sure to go back and do that. And as I've mentioned in many of the videos, this may be very easy and simple for you, and that's great. Just go ahead and do a couple of problems for each so that you are warmed up and ready before you move on to the next concept. Again, this is very important that we understand how to do this math correctly because we're going to be working with dosage calculation, and numbers always represent something. And in this case, it represents the dosage of medication that will be administered to your patient. So being off by 1 decimal can make a huge difference. So it's very important that you take the time to master all of the concepts and skills so that you're ready and strong in your dosage calculations. So today we're going to talk about the additional rules for division of decimals. So this is the second part. In the last video, we talked about multiplication of decimals, and today we'll talk about division. So to go over the important additional rules, we want to remember that if you see 13.75 and then you have the division sign and 2.2, you should say it like 13.75 divided by 2.2, because when we line up our problem, we need to understand which one goes in the box. So here, this is the box, or sometimes we call it the doghouse. It's what number are we putting in the doghouse in order to divide by the number. So it's really important that we understand how to set up that problem. So looking at that, we would say it 13.75 divided by 2.2. So the number after the divided by would go on the outside of the division box. So here's our division box, and the divided by number, which is 2.2, goes outside of the division box, and 13.75 goes inside that box. Now, for fun, again, we call it the doghouse sometimes, so we say 13.75 would be in the doghouse and 2.2 would be outside of that doghouse. If a decimal is present in the number on the outside of the box, so this number is 2.2 on the outside of the box, you must move it all the way to the right and count the numbers of places that you move it, because when you count the number of places there, you have to do the same on the numbers inside the division box. So we'll talk about that in a second. Then you move the decimal from the number inside the box and move it to the exact number that you moved the decimal. So here's the decimal. If we move it 1 here, then we're going to move that decimal 1 here as well. The decimal for the answer goes directly above the decimal that's inside the box, because that's why we're moving the decimal here. We move the decimal over so that when we finish our problem, we can just move the decimal directly up. So hopefully that makes sense. I'm going to show you on my pad in a second, but I want to go over all of the rules first. So again, we said we would write the problem like this. We would say that this is 13.75, so we put that in the division box, and divided by 2.2, so that goes on the outside of that division box. So we set up the problem correctly. That's the first thing that we need to do. So step 1, first move the decimal in the number on the outside of the box from left to right. You want to count how many spaces or numbers did you move the decimal. So in this case, if we move it here, let's see if I can set this up. So if we take it and we move it here to the outside, we want to do the same here So this is where our decimal is now going to be. So we move that over, and it was only one space, as this says down here. We only moved it one space here, so we only had to move the decimal one space there. So that's the first step. After you set up the problem, you move the decimal points and you make sure that you move it on both sides. So hopefully that is making sense. Now for step 2, you want to move the decimal point inside the box, which we did. We moved it here, 1 point, because it is the same number of spaces. It always has to be the same because you're keeping the placeholder to make sure that you're working with the same value of numbers. So that was one space here again, like we said, and one space here. So the decimal is going to go there. So I can even just put my decimal right there. Okay, so I know my decimal is going to be in that space. Now, then you go through the division problem so that when you rewrite the problem, you end up with 137.5 divided by 22, because now we've moved that decimal out of the 22 and we've moved it over here, so it's no longer 13.75, it's now 137.5. And on the other videos that we've talked about, the placeholder for the zero, this zero is added here for the placeholder, so you have 137.50. Now, when you go ahead and do your division out, you have to work across to see what it divides into. So when you take 22 into 137, that's what I would think about first. We think about, okay, how many times would 22 go into 137? Okay, 120. Okay, so I make first a guess in my head and I go, well, if it were 5, well, 5 times 2 is 10. Nope, it's got to be one number next. So I go here and I say 6, and then I take 6 and I multiply 6 by 22 and I get 132. Again, these are just remembering that we're going to make sure that we keep our decimal in this spot. Okay, so we want to make sure that if the decimal is here, that our ones, tens, and hundreds are on this side. So these are just helping you remember that you need to keep everything aligned correctly. So if we have 137.5 minus 132, we end up here with 5, and then you have the 55 here because you have bringing that. We're not worried about it here because we're bringing it up here. So we end up writing 55. So now we're thinking, well, how many times does 2 go into 55? Well, if we said, we know that, let's see, 2 into 50, I'm sorry, 22. I just said 2. 22 won't go once because we know that 22 plus 22, or 2 times 22, is 44, right? So we know that 44 is the maximum number. We can't times it by 3 because then we'd be into 66. So we go, okay, it is 22 times 2. So I write my 2, and then I go down and I say 2 times 22 is 44. And when I get that, I get 11. But I still need to go one more decimal over because we already know that we move the decimal up. So I need to go one more decimal to the right. So if I have 11, I have to add a 0. And if I add a 0 here, then I say 22 into 110. If I say 5 times 22 is 110, so I say, okay, that is 5. So I get minus 110, and I have 0 left over. So my answer then is 6.25. Okay, so our answer was 6.25, and I had circled it here on the other one. And then the way you can check this is you can go back and you can multiply 6.25 by 22 and you will get 137.5. So I'm hoping that going step by step and really moving over the decimal and doing that work with you, that helped you to see it visually. So there are practice problems on the math packet that you can find down here. Go ahead and open up the bit.ly link that has the math packet, print it out, and follow step by step as you go, and you will be ready to rock and roll when we get to dosage calculations. Thank you so much for your time today. I hope you have a beautiful day and that you're enjoying your time learning about allied health and medical assisting. I'll see you again online. Bye-bye.